I straight away go to the two key words in the title that probably you might think it's a little ambitious, that post-postcolonialism, ecocriticism and literature. What I submit before you by this, through the two key words of post-colonialism and ecocriticism, is that ecocriticism is in a way territorializing the entire earth. So it is like the mapping of the globe. And now, not only the earth, we have our mission Mars, mission Moon, and whatnot. So, what I think is that these two discourses share quite a bit of common ground. And that is why I feel that when we speak of ecocriticism, we are not talking about a nation, any one particular territory that often post-colonialism speaks of and identifies. We are talking about the whole earth. And this is the reason why I submit that my title is Post-Postcolonialism. Temporarily, of course, also post-colonialism enters the English department much earlier. And what we might find then slightly surprising is that these two areas have so much of common ground, and yet scholars only recently have thought of sharing or pooling in their ideas and resources. We can find Elizabeth Delory talking about that our ideas of the environment actually begins with the spread of the European Empire, and therefore these are actually very nearby areas of discourse. The impact, if you look at it at the right column, more importantly, is that although we know there are differences, there are divides, the north-south divide is there, the first world, third world divide is there, of course, but the emphasis here falls not just on one world or the other world within this world. What we are talking about ultimately is all humanity. And as deep ecologists would say, actually, that if we are thinking about our environment, if we are thinking about the earth, it is not to save the earth, it is actually to save ourselves. And this is where, we often think of through a kind of an utilitarian approach where Arne Naes, and I'm very happy to know from Dr. Maria that he did visit your department. When he speaks about that the well-being of the non-human life on earth is valuable in itself. It is not useful just in the sense of the usefulness for the human purpose. But it is so what we find is that when we speak of utility and the human being versus the non-humans, we have to come out and think of all species and value all species. That is the emphasis with ecocriticism. I give you just an example of the colonial history vis-a-vis India. India's contribution to the world economy was 23% before the British rule, and it came down, it plummeted to 4% after 200 years of colonization. Similarly, if you look at from the ecocritical point of view, if you look at the entire earth, then we are not talking about this extinction of 10 species or 20 birds, or we are talking about what Maldives did in 2009. It conducted an entire cabinet underwater. And this it did a few months before the Copenhagen Climate Summit the same year, in order to raise awareness that probably Maldives would be the first, among the first nation, if not the first nation, to have refugees out of the climate change. Climate change refugees would be from Maldives and all these smaller island nations everywhere, all over the world. This is a visual from the Inconvenient Truth, where we see on the left what Mount Kilimanjaro looks like and what Mount Kilimanjaro might look like when all its ice cappings are gone massive erosion has taken place, and it is a desertification of the same thing, same landscape might happen. However, with all these things in mind, we are given data, we know about it, but yet there seems to be a problem in taking action, taking effective action. And that might be because of an idea floated now mainly, and this word is from antiquity, but this idea is floated mainly by market economists and people who believe that technology is the panacea for everything, who believe that this earth has always been and would be a horn of plenty. And therefore scarcity is not an environmental issue, it is an economic issue. And therefore with technology, with enough money, these interventions, things can be taken care of. And of course, we were talking about why are thinkers and experts of these two areas not coming together, or very recently have they come together, because of thing that as human beings we are too self-centered in our own culture, in developing, in erecting, in constructing, and therefore nature comes after. So this is the old nature culture divide. I was talking about also that chronologically, if you look at it into our departments, post-colonialism comes in the mid-1960s, whereas 3 decades take place and go by when environmental awareness and that environmental studies should be across all disciplines of knowledge, including our area of study, that is literature departments. That happens only by the mid-90s. However, if we look at a kind of these days, we have travel writing, which is proliferating as a relatively newer genre of literature. You will be slightly interested and surprised to know that one of the earliest journals on ecology happened as a kind of to satisfy the violent hobby of the colonial hunters. So this was called the Journal of the Society for the Preservation of the Wild Fauna. There is a big irony in this word preservation, because they would be preserving the fauna of territory X this year so that they can hunt the fauna of territory Y this year and come back to territory X maybe 2 years later, when the fauna would be the dwindling fauna of the other areas would be then kept as preservation. And this journal ran till the end of the empire. This is another interesting thing. Whereas, and I'll be quickly going down these few slides. This is something which we all know. Actually, our primordial stories about ourselves and our earth not only acknowledge, but there is a deep sense of reverence for nature. Look at all the mythologies. I have 5 slides here. I will quickly go through them. The primal earth goddess in the Greek mythology, Gaia. Then the sun god Ra from the Egyptian mythology. Then we have the yang and the yin, that is yang talking about sunshine and yin talking about darkness, again from Chinese mythology. In the entire pantheon of Japanese mythology, we have interestingly the sun goddess and the moon god. And when we come to India, we have deities, we have gods to be worshipped for fire, for water, for the winds, for thunder, for the sun, so on and so forth. Now, from these gods all over the world of the ancient societies, they are forces of nature. I come to a few questions for all of us to ponder. These are questions that I don't have immediate answers. I don't think there is one answer to each question. But what I'm asking is, sometimes what literary critical studies does is they take us towards asking important questions, not always immediately giving us answers. And in that direction, what we see is from the previous slides. If we revered nature so much, then when was that divide that happened? When did we sever the ties? Now, Slavoj Zizek, he puts it in a different way. He doesn't answer it, but he identifies our symptom, the human problem. And he says that we know that ecological catastrophe is possible. And yet, somehow we do not believe. Now, can we then, my next question would be, that can we approximately identify when this belief withered away? Or commensurately, can we think of certain human events that took us to this belief? As deep ecologists often say, that is then human population explosion responsible for the inequity that we have all around the world between human beings and human beings, as well as humans and the non-humans? And the final question concerns us. We are in the higher education institutions. It concerns that our modern education is very, very competitive education that we are all in, which asks us to be materially successful, which asks us to grab a designation and succeed in that direction. Is it our education system that is making us insensitive towards our environment, towards all the vandalism that we do towards our environment? So I put these questions and I ask all of us, as including myself, to ponder over it. And whereas if we now from these aspects, if we come to our discipline of literature, after the print world, reading literature was considered to be a very private, individual, non-participatory kind of an affair. But I believe, and I put this before you, that doing or teaching literature is also a kind of an activism. When we have one teacher who can influence at the same time a class of 40 people, 60 people, that itself is some kind of activism that we are talking about. And if we look at it, that if we are all attuned to think critically about a crisis or a problem, that also is activism. So what I put before you is that along with post-colonial discourse, ecocriticism should also become part of our curriculum. And what is this then? Ecocriticism, what is it? I borrow a very simple definition from Cheryl Lotfelty, who says it is simply the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. Very broad, very inclusive definition. And then within that, we can think of sub-areas. And what is the task for ecocritics then? As Richard Kerridge identifies, that the task is to bring about a kind of shift in our cultural values, in our zeitgeist, and therefore in our everyday behavior. If we bring about incremental, little by little, these changes, because all the environmental dangers that we are now facing, they really ask us to take very rapid action. And therefore, this is probably what is the identified task for ecocritics. And among the various functions and definitions of literature, it being a mirror, it being a lamp, it being a chisel and a hammer, and so on and so forth, literature is also an interesting record. Look at this old Babylonian, Sumerian epic Gilgamesh, which is basically what? A story about the ever-existing duel between the good and the evil, gods and men. Then it talks about withstanding temptation and seduction, and of course mortality. Perhaps that is the key then, that humans are mortal, and in a way then we often think that since we are anyway going to die, the problem is for the next generation. So we are not responsible. In that sense, often we pass on, and as we have now come to realize, what are we passing on to our children? Gilgamesh speaks about an immortalizing plant at the bottom of the sea. And if you connect that epic with an epic, very famous epic from Indian epic Ramayana, there is also the mention of a magical herb called the Sanjeevani Booty, which is administered to the brother of the king in order to save him from near certain death. Now this herb, by the way, which is an actual herb, which has a scientific name, Calendula bryopteris. It is a medicinal herb, well tested, and it is accepted and it is used actually in the Indian branch of medicine, Ayurveda. And Ayurveda is one of the 5 most important knowledge texts that India has given to the world. Now, I will ask you to look at the dating of our epic, which is now dated around 5000 BC, and Ayurveda. So what is happening is that from praxis of something, we codify and theorize it much later. Theory really follows praxis. So then in our stories, there is mention of the herb, that the herb then comes into the domain of medicine, knowledge of medicine, 3000 years later. I am making a big jump from here and I am coming to the modern texts in our English-speaking world that are viewed as ecocritical texts. And here again, I know that you are the Department of English and American Studies. You all know Emerson's essay Nature, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. But these are now identified as significant modern texts in English that are ecocritical in nature. And of course, Walden. Now, what I've done with Walden is on the right hand side is the influence of Walden on W.B. Yeats. So here is the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and Lake Isle of Innisfree by W.B. Yeats is a direct influence of Walden. So we are looking at even right from the 19th century or a little before that, we are looking at these influences, and we are looking at the acknowledgement of that nature is not for itself. It is a force, and that does bring about a change in the human behavior and the human life. An earlier beginning can be made from America if we come to England, and this very significant year, 1789, where I put before you a poem by Blake, who you all know, who has these poems on chimney sweepers and chimneys and the industrial rise of industrialism. And this poem, The Echoing Green, can be actually read as the vanishing landscape, where for centuries there was a common plot in a village where children played and old people sat by and remembered their old times, and suddenly towards the end of the poem, sport no more seen on the darkening green. So the green, that plot might have been bought over by a factory owner, and suddenly a factory will come up now. It's gone forever. Did this happen? I'm going to show you, yes, it happened, really, and therefore it is not just a kind of a poetic truth, but in reality it did happen. Now, we were talking about in my previous slide, can we identify certain events or certain years that created this kind of a human and nature divide, and we have 2 terms that often one is Holocene, which is an epoch that we often speak of from the Paleolithic Ice Age. When the Paleolithic Ice Age started melting, the earth started getting warmer. Whereas the Anthropocene is that epoch that we talk about when human behavior, human culture, human constructs significantly and irreversibly affected the Earth's geology, Earth's climate, Earth's ecosystems. And then people are actually divided. When do we see this beginning of Anthropocene? Do we see it with around 1800 with industrialization? Or do we see it in a way where it really was a quick destruction, the atomic bomb, and leading to the dystopic end of human beings? So do we see it 1945 or do we see it 1800? That's a debate, but certainly we are in the epoch of the Anthropocene. That is without a doubt. Talking about industrialization and dystopia, here is often not studied. Mary Shelley's work, 1826, The Last Man. Literally the image you have, the last man standing on the edge of a precipice. And you will have a sense of the deja vu if you read this novel. It narrates about Europe in the late 21st century. We are already in the early 21st century. And there is a mysterious pandemic raging, sweeping across the world, wiping out nearly the entire humanity. So this is the connection between industrialization and dystopia. And I was talking about, of course, Wordsworth, such an important, most important name we often take. And I was talking about when in Blake's poem, do we really see a plot of land taken away and a factory planted there? Now you will find in this poem lines composed, it's a long title for a poem, lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during the tour, and the exact date is given July 13, 1798. You will find when you read this poem that apart from the title, the Abbey is never mentioned. So what happens to the Abbey actually? Wordsworth speaks about this poem that he started in his mind. He started composing this poem as he left Tintern, crossed the River Wye 4 or 5 days, rambled with his sister Dorothy, and reached Bristol. And there in Bristol, recollecting things in tranquility, he wrote down this entire poem. Now this is an image only 10 years later of that place that Wordsworth visited. This is an image, a painting by William Hebel, and you can see somewhere in the middle of the canvas, the ruined abbey. You can see on the left of it, the blue water of the Wye. Now, when you read, incidentally, this long title poem is referred to just as Tintonite, Wordsworth's poem Tintonite, which actually mentions Wye rather than the abbey, the River Wye. Now, what happened is this, that revisiting River Wye, revisiting Tintern Abbey, these mentions in the title, Wordsworth visits Tintern first in 1793 and then revisits in 1798. In these intervening 5 years, 2 sawmills come up. The abbey has been abandoned since long. Henry VIII decreed against, when he broke away from Rome, he decreed against Roman Catholic institutions, and that abbey is destroyed and shut down. Now that structure still remains. And between 1793 and 1795, 2 mills come up. They dump their refuse into the River Wye to the extent that 1 kilometer long of the water has turned black. Now this, since there are no factory laws when the factories come, and factory owners are not supposed to provide any housing for the workers, this abandoned, ruined abbey structure becomes a shelter for the workers. And this entire place then is so filthy that Wordsworth literally has to move away, away up into the hills. And therefore it is literally lines composed a few miles above Tintern, because as the place is, it does not satisfy the quintessential nature that Wordsworth wants to write about. He has to. Now I could have I could have also subtitled this slide as pollution and silence, and pollution and end of poetry, and so it really what makes Wordsworth, it stops his creativity. He has to move away literally in order to write the poem. So this is an interesting thing, that we speak of deaths due to pollution, that death can be taken twofold. Death of art first before biological death. And here I'm quickly going to move from this slide just to remind you that romantic poetry is often taken as a kind of a beginning for ecocriticism, when ecocriticism and literature they are discussed. Mainly because romantic poetry is actually not anthropocentric. And you can see from the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge that this arbitrary killing of the albatross damns the mariner. And then when he actually acknowledges the meanest of the creatures, the water snakes, that is what he salvages some of the committed murder, the sin that he commits. So this is in that sense. Then I am putting this poem, or part of the poem here, and of course when we speak about poets, romantic poets like Keats and their sensuousness, and how they are so attuned to all the sights and sounds and smells and the feeling on the skin of nature. Here is to autumn, which is there is a clear-cut divide. That is music of the spheres, music of the trees, music of the water bodies, and that is natural. Whereas song is a cultural construct, and so one can interpret it in this way when he asks autumn, "Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too." Now, romantic literature can be interpreted ecocritically, but literature that had specific emphasis on our environmental degradation and as a result a threat to all of us actually started happening from the 1960s. This novel by Rachel Carson is often taken as a kind of a beginning. It's titled Silent Spring, and it talks about that the silence of the birds in a particular area in America, and why the birds are all dead and silent is because of the chemical fertilizers and the pesticides that are being sprayed on the crops. So it is the cycle that not because we sprayed the robins directly, what she says, but because the poison traveled step by step through the now familiar elm leaf earthworm robin. So the elm is sprayed, the leaf of the elm tree, earthworm is poisoned, and the earthworm is eaten by the robin birds and they die. So this is the cycle that happens. Often we are myopic, that we only look at things from one perspective only, often forget that nature itself has its own cycle. So things have a kind of a rolling effect on other things. Greg Garrett in this book, 2007 book, Ecocriticism, the definitive book, and people can begin with this, takes up Rachel Carson's fable for tomorrow, Silent Spring. And Garrett then mentions that this text, actually, Rachel Carson, what she does is she relies on the older literary genres of pre-romantic genres like the pastoral. Even Wordsworth has written pastoral poems, and of course the apocalypse. And this is the if we then with this knowledge of Rachel Carson's work, if we revisit the title, Rachel Carson has acknowledged that she has taken the title from Keats's ballad, La Belle Dame Sans Mercy. And if we now look at it from an ecocritical perspective, we will find that what we have is the lady who has disappeared at the earth because the night is the spoiler of ecology. And so no birds sing. I have a small data below that at any given point of time in autumn and winter, actually, there are at least 8 species of birds that can be found in England. But that is, from there, if there are no birds, that's the alarming thing. And we can read the pastoral as a kind of a dream held out of a life in harmony with nature and away from the hustle and bustle of modernity, city life, etc., or mental peace and therefore physical health, so on and so forth. But an ecocritical reading of the pastoral that has been made by Ecocritics talk about these few points. That is, it talks about, it inherently indicates rather possession and ownership of land, and therefore the exploitation of the land and the natural resources, mining for precious metals, of course, and control of the laboring people, and of course the subject position of man. And similarly, if there are charges against pastoral literature, there are charges against romantics that they over aestheticize nature. This is a charge that is there. And therefore, there I find there's a problem that if you demand in a kind of prescriptive didactic mode from criticism that literature would be so and so, then I think we would be having two camps. The creative writers are never going to follow any diktats from the critics. And yet, as I see that, literature, again, it probably raises our civility quotient. On one hand, civilization has its pressure of its own of progress. It talks about the human race and the culture so developed now. Whereas the civility actually, it asks us to stop, to think about others, not just other human beings, but other species also. And Richard Kerridge here gives an interesting word and says that the starting word can be care, which can be, when we say care about, that talks about a feeling or an emotion. And when we say take care of something, then it speaks about an action. Therefore, the word care can be both personal as well as collective. So, what did we discuss? I'm nearing the last 3-4 minutes of my time. I put in before you the proximity and the divergences between the discourses of postcolonialism and ecocriticism. I also discussed certain terms, cornucopia, holocene, anthropocene, etc. As an academic, I shared my resolve that we have to teach ecocriticism, we have to bring it within the literary critical curriculum. And I also, in doing so, I shared the problem that as a teacher, the framing the pedagogy would be a problem. The problem would be that it will test our competence because environmental problem is not just the lookout. In fact, it is not the lookout of literature, because if we look at, say, alternative energy, then I'm just reading a book on alternative energy by a professor of physics, for example. And therefore, but what do we understand from this? We have to actually raise our competence level in order to bring this into our curriculum. And of course, my job here, and I'm primarily addressing to students and researchers, both from India as well as Slovakia. Here I'm sharing a few starting materials. Greg Garrett's book I showed to you, Ecocriticism, that was an authored book in 2007. This is an edited book in 2014, the Oxford Handbook of Ecocriticism, which actually there are 34 essays divided into history, theory, genre, perspectives from countries, Japan, India, America, so on and so forth. And there is an interesting essay, the contemporary English novel and its challenges to ecocriticism, where the author, Astrid Rack, talks about that English fiction defies ecocritical analysis simply because it is too much involved in itself or experimentation or too unmindful of the environment. But then again, he contends that, we were talking about the prescription by ecocritics to the writer. He says that the work need not be overtly environmentalist to merit an ecocritical reading. There can be some kind of a common ground, a link between them. And then there is an analysis of a novel here from the lens of the problems of urban life and ecocriticism in cities. That how do we look at it? This is an interesting book which I often suggest to my students. We have been doing this from 2019. If I may share, this Ecocriticism entered our syllabus only in 2019, and this is an important book that we share with our students, which is actually includes good bit of literature from famous authors like Amitabh Ghosh, Jan Martel, James Coetzee, Chinua Achebe, and some lesser known authors also comparatively. But the dilemma of the newly independent countries of the south of the world, that they just became maybe 10 years, 20 years or 30 years ago, they started looking at developing themselves, developing their society, the economic, the how to govern and the foreign trade and the question of how strong is their currency, so on and so forth. The moment they are thinking of all these, suddenly they are put with the pressure of thinking about their environment also. Now this is a problem they have inherited, what we can see from the colonial masters. And this tension is well discussed here in this book. There are interesting essays, for example, what are the pros and cons of vegetarianism? So one can. So this is my last slide then. In 1938, in Three Guineas, Virginia Woolf says that as a woman, she neither has nor wants a country, but seeks the whole world as a dwelling place. Now, obviously, Woolf being high modern, and her emphasis might be more cultural than about nature, but one can really think about reading this. So one can revisit old texts and look at it again from the ecocritical point of view. We can read women's issues here, obviously. We can this essay was written against the backdrop of the Second World War. So again, Anthropocene and war. So we can read it from that perspective. We can read it from the perspective of the typically male proclivity. We say that they colonize. If you look at all the wars, they are brought about by men, and all the colonial masters are men. So from that angle also, philosophically, of course, there is. If I was reminded of Heidegger's poetry language thought, which talks about this earth being probably till now the only dwelling place that we have. So the question of dwelling, vis-a-vis, philosophically looking at it, and of course we can also think of this interesting essay by Derrida, Eating Well, when he says that food is outside, then it comes inside and nourishes us, and so we need a diversity of food and diversity of food growing ecology. If that is true, then we also intellectually need diversity of people for our intellectual mental health. But all these can be discussed at probably a later point of time. I'm just putting these pebbles in your mental pond and creating certain little waves. And I leave it there. I thank once again the Department of English and American Studies, CPU, Nitra, Slovakia, and I thank all those who have patiently given their time to listen to me. Thank you very much indeed.